Okay, great. So, chapter 34, verse 1. Vatetse Dina bat Leah asher yalda liYaakov lirot bivnot haaretz. So Dina, the daughter of Leah, who was born to Jacob, went out to see, to look at the daughters of the land. Okay, so anything that jumps out at you from that verse right away?
Mention Jacob.
I'm sorry. Did you say that again?
Did not mention Jacob as
Right.
being her father.
Right. Well, I mean, it mentioned him, but in a sort of roundabout way, right? Leah, the daughter, I'm sorry, Dinah, the daughter of Leah, who was born to Jacob, right? I mean, it's a strange kind of way of phrasing that, right? I mean, especially, given, I mean, this is something that we still have. I mean, in the sort of traditional normative context, your Hebrew name is your name, Ben or Bat, your father,
Mhm.
right? And now we certainly allow and maybe even encourage people to say Ben or Bat, father and mother, but it's untraditional. It's not normative, although it's certainly becoming more and more common, right? So why is she called Dina Bat Leah, right? Well, Rashi wants to know the same thing. Bat Leah velo Bat Yaakov, right? The daughter of Leah and not the daughter of Jacob, right? However, she was called the daughter of Leah because of her going out. Okay, because it says Vatetse, Leah, Tetse Dina. Dina went out. All right. Sha'af he yatzanit haita, because Leah was also in the habit of going out. We saw earlier, I mean, we're not looking at it now, but in chapter 30, and Leah came forth toward him, came forth. So the same what's the word I'm looking for? The same
Behavior.
verb, right? Yeah, which the root of is yatsa yud sadi aleph, to go out. Okay, so because the same verb is used for Leah and for Dina, and so we have the famous proverb, like mother, like daughter, right? I mean, I'm more familiar with like father, like son. Um, Now, having said that, I mean, I am not sure, frankly, whether this is merely expository or whether it is in some way condemnatory, right? I mean, the root yatsa is generally not positive, right? Especially for a female, right? I mean, in that society, right, females are supposed to stay at home, stay in the bosom of the family, as it were. So going out is not such a great thing. And there's a Yiddish term for a prostitute is nafka. I don't know if anybody is from. I mean, my Yiddish is not that good, but I've studied some, like, you know how Yiddish words are derived from Hebrew or Aramaic. and nafka in Aramaic has the same meaning as the Hebrew yatsa, right? So clearly in that context, going out is not a positive thing, right? And I honestly don't know whether this is meant as criticism of Dina and as criticism of Leah, or whether it's simply, an explanation. But I have to think that Rashi has an agenda, right? Rashi doesn't just randomly explain things unless there's a reason for it. So just before I give my thoughts, let me throw that out there. Anybody have some thoughts on this at all?
Well, the Eitz Chaim actually says it's been interpreted as some medieval and modern commentators as a reference to some coquettish or promiscuous conduct.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that is so, right? I mean, if you look at, I mean, you don't even have to go to rabbinics. I mean, the story itself, right? The story itself, right? So Shechem rapes Dinah, and then it's described first as rape and then more like seduction. And then he wants to marry her, right? And they say, fine. I mean, from our contemporary morals and mores, it's pretty shocking, right? It's pretty shocking. But I don't think, I mean, at the same time that the Bible doesn't approve of what was done to her, it doesn't approve of what she did either, right? I mean, it's kind of that old, and women still hear it. Well, if you didn't dress that way, you wouldn't have gotten raped, right? If you weren't in that place where you shouldn't have been to, not that it's okay, but it's kind of really your fault, right? And there is right there is this attitude of sort of blaming the victim, right? I think that is present anyway. So let's go on. And Shechem, the son of Hamor, the Hivite, the prince of the land, saw her, and he took her, lay with her, and violated her. Okay, so what is the difference between took her, lay with her, and violated her, right? Again, I mean, the underlying assumption of Rashi, right, is that this text is divine, that God wrote it. God is not a sloppy author, right? And therefore, there's nothing superfluous, right? There's nothing superfluous, so that lay with her and violate her are two different things, right? So Rashi says lay with her is kadarka in a natural way, and violated her is shalo kadarka in an unnatural way. Okay, now these are, again, sometimes the translation is not all that helpful, right? Because Bia Kadarka and Bia Shalo Kadarka are halachic terms with specific definition. Okay, Bia is intercourse. All right, so Bia Kadarka is vaginal intercourse. Bia Shalo Kadarka is anal intercourse. Okay, I mean, I apologize for being that explicit, but you can't really understand the Rashi unless you understand these two terms, right? Kadarka and Shalo Kadarka. right? So he had both vaginal and anal intercourse with her. So those are two different things. Okay. And his soul cleaved to Dinah, the daughter of Jacob. He loved the girl and spoke to the girl's heart. Now, the whole thing, right? I mean, Gail, I see you shaking your head, right? So say something.
Well, either it really wasn't that, if she was coquettish, maybe she wasn't exactly rape. They may have been two young people whose parents weren't too happy.
Well, on that note, again, those of you who have read late 90s literature will probably know what I mean. But I'm not going to mention it right now. Right now, when I'm seeing the text, I'm parsing it in not two, but three ways, because VaYikach can also mean he married her. I mean, in the Bible, there is no difference between
right, ki yikach isha, right, absolutely.
So it might have been that he perhaps I'm thinking maybe empty, valid, whatever. He made a gesture of marrying her, which could be interpreted to be romantic, or in the ancient world it could not be. But in any case, it was at least perhaps in the mind of Shechem, he was legitimizing his rape and or just intercourse with her. So so parsing like this, he married her and he laid with her as is expected of a married couple, and then to the extent that marital rape exists in the ancient world, I think after that, initial act, something like that might have occurred, and that was the violation of honor.
Right. I mean, the only thing that strikes me as odd is that the two verses seem almost out of order, right? He took her and he had, he did with her whatever he did, right? And then he fell in love with her, right? I mean, I know, I get it. I understand that, trying to enter into the mindset of a world of 3,500 years ago, right, is not easy. I get it, right? I get that, but it still strikes me. I mean, it still strikes me that there's tremendous ambivalence here, right? There's ambivalence towards Dinah. There's ambivalence towards Shem, right? There's going to be ambivalence towards Shimon and Levi. I mean, there's ambivalence all over, which is maybe not a bad thing. I mean, from my perspective, one of the strengths of the Tanakh is precisely that it leaves room for ambiguity, right? It's not heavily didactic, right? It's not black and white. It's not a comic book, right? And there's room to make up your own mind, and nobody can say to you, oh, that interpretation is just so completely out of bounds that you're not even allowed to bring it down, because I guarantee you somebody else has brought it down hundreds of years before you did, right? But there's a lot. It just strikes me that there's a lot of ambivalence in this text towards a lot of people. Okay, so he spoke to the girl's heart. And how did he speak to the girl's heart? Seductive words, right? Seductive words, right? What are his seductive words according to Rashi? Right? See, look how much money your father spent to buy a tiny little plot of land. I'll marry you and you will obtain the whole city and all of its fields, right? It's extremely romantic and seductive, right? Right? I don't even know what to say. I mean, I really don't know what to say because I don't want to be impious or disrespectful towards Rashi, right? But then again, Rashi's French. I mean, he's French. He should have a little bit more of an idea of romance, right? I mean, he's French after all, right? But somebody was going to say something.
But that's, almost 1,000 years ago. Things were different.
Right. No, I get it, but I don't know. The whole thing strikes me as somewhat bizarre. I don't know. And then, I mean, is this, so if Dina found these words extremely romantic, I mean, what does that say about her? Right? What does that say? What does that say about her? Right. So
in all of this, there's no attention here at any rate as to what Dina's thinking or how active a player she was in any of this. And maybe, she was saying, oh, she's poor and she doesn't have this or that. And so maybe these were words to her heart. I mean, I don't know.
Right. I mean, the only thing, I mean, your first point is indisputable, right? Your first point is absolutely indisputable. We have no idea what Dina wants. Nobody asks her, nobody cares, right? She sets the whole chain of events in motion by going out to gaze upon the daughters of the land. But once she sets the chain of events in motion, she is an object. She's not a subject. She's an object. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think Maggie Anton wrote a novel about Dina, right? She came and spoke at our shul a number of years ago, right? And that's clearly, from a feminist critique, and obviously you don't have to be female to be feminist, right? One of the things that absolutely leaps out at you is that, nobody thinks to ask her, well, how do you feel, right? I mean, was it rape or was it seduction, right? I mean, to a certain extent, both of them can be condemned, I suppose, but, rape and seduction are not the same thing, right? On the other hand, there is sometimes whatever, right? But, so Shem says, oh, I want to marry her. And her brothers are the one who say, okay, right? Her brothers are the one, nobody seems to ask her, what does she want, right? And so I said I agreed with the first part, but not necessarily the second part, but now I've forgotten what the second part of what you said is, Lori.
Let's see if I remember.
Right.
I guess it was just to make an example, to say where she was offered, look at the money and you'll acquire a city and fields. So if money or wealth were an issue for her, this may be seen as a really positive thing. You know,
Right.
now I'll be comfortable. But I don't think that was an issue. Didn't I think, don't they say that, you know, Jacob had, you know, lots of cattle and land
Yeah,
and
he
this and
was
that.
he was
So,
well off. Absolutely, he
yeah.
was well off. So look, I mean, there is also a Hebrew phrase which I think is true. All right, im ha'ochel ba ha'te'avon, right? Along with the food comes the appetite, right? Or, you know, it is very rare to meet a wealthy person who says, I have enough. I have enough. I do not desire to acquire any more. Right? And that's why it says in Pirkei Avot, right? Ezehu Ashir Hasamech Bechoko, right? Who is wealthy? The one who is satisfied with their lot, right? I mean, not yet. It's very, very rare. I mean, you do see it. You see it. I mean, Bill Gates, for example, right? I think, he's basically said, I have enough. I don't need, contrast that with Jeff Bezos or so many other people, right? They don't, but so the fact that she came from a wealthy family does not necessarily preclude her being seduced by the possibility of obtaining wealth, right? But certainly then it is the claims of appetite, not the claims of hunger, right? Barnaby.
So if I may, I also might be projecting out of my own experiences here, but when I'm reading this, I might have been hesitant to cast Shechem as a manipulator, as a villain. Reading this midrash kind of casts a light on Shechem as a potential manipulator, taking advantage. What is seductive? It's not like whispers of sweet nothings. It's something that evidently Dina desired for one reason or another. And what leapt out at me was, look how much money your father squandered. And what I'm reading into this is some sort of neglect from her family. Well, mainly her father, but also her family in general. And in comes, the Prince Charming, so to speak, and telling her what she wants to hear, so that that she'll marry him. That's what I think it might be a consequence of, and certainly if you just read the sheet straight through with barely a mention of Dina outside of this narrative, you can get the feeling that she felt a bit neglected, and therefore this would make sense in that regard.
Absolutely. Somebody else want to say something?
I was going to say, certainly thinking back to, the grandfather and the great grandfather, they sort of weren't the world's greatest parents. And certainly we know that Jacob really doted on Joseph. So she's the only girl. He could have doted on her, or else gone since he doted on Joseph. It's highly likely that she probably did feel a little left out.
Right. Go ahead.
Just wanted to add something to what Gail said. She was a daughter of Leah. Leah was the unloved wife.
Right.
And this would pass on somewhat to her children. Also, again, the role of women at that time. How often are women mentioned in the Torah? She happens to be one. And women were almost like commodities in terms of marriage. Marriage was a business transaction. at the
Right.
time. And there was little or no consideration given to what the girl wanted. And
That's true. Well, even the fact that her brothers, oh,
Yeah, go
sorry.
ahead. I'm finished.
I'm sorry, I was just adding on
Yeah.
what we just read, the fact that her brothers were the ones that came forward and said, yeah, she'll marry you. It's, but again, no one knew what she really wanted, at least not as written here.
Right. Right. And it is, I mean, it is clearly a business transaction, right? I mean, and Shechem and his family sees it as a business transaction too. I mean, we'll see that. I mean, that's not even reading between the lines. That's explicit.
Yes.
It's very explicit. Right? Okay, so let's go on. So Jacob's sons, right, came from the field when they heard, and the men were grieved. And they were very angry because a scandalous, a sacrilegious thing had been done in Israel to lie with the daughter of Jacob, v'chen lo ya'aseh, and such a thing ought not be done. Okay, what's the problem, right? What's, so they are furious. Okay, and interestingly, I mean, and obviously it helps if you know Hebrew, but if you look at the verb that's used, it's lishkav. Okay, lishkav means simply to have relations with, right? To have intercourse with. It is not, it is not la'anot or la'anos, right? It is not here described as rape, right? It is simply described as having intercourse, right? Now, normally, like if I'm thinking how it's used in Leviticus, it is generally forbidden or illicit intercourse, right? But it's not rape, right? I mean, if you have consensual relations with somebody that you're not supposed to have relations with, right? That's still illicit or forbidden intercourse, but it's not rape, right? And it strikes me. I mean, Rashi doesn't really comment on the choice of the verb lishkav, but nevertheless, I mean, it seems to be somewhat less than rape, at least in the text itself, right? But now comes Rashi, and such ought not to be done, right? So I'll read the Rashi, and then we'll go back and say, what's the question that Rashi is seeking to answer, right? Such ought not to be done. V'chen lo ye'aseh. La'anot et habitulot, to violate virgins, shaha'umot gadru atzman min ha'ariot al yedei ha'mabul. Okay, because the nations of the world, the nations took it upon themselves to refrain from illicit relationships because of the flood, right? In other words, what's the question Rashi's seeking to answer, and then how does he answer it?
Why is this so terrible? What made it, what are the consequences?
Right. In other words, when it says, and such ought not to be done, right? Who says such ought not to be done? How is Shem supposed to know that such ought not to be done, right? I mean, when you have traditional societies, right, there are certain rules that everybody knows, right? Such certain rules that everybody knows. And I will tell you that, when Kelly and I first got married, I violated all sorts of rules that I never knew existed, right? Because the South is a very traditional rule-bound society, right? And I constantly did things that everybody knows ought not to be done, right? Only I didn't know that they ought not to be done, right? And but so why are these things not to be done, and how do you know? Well, because, in other words, because you could say, right, well, look, obviously the Hebrews or the Israelites knew that this is something that you're not allowed to do, right? But how is Shem supposed to know that it was wrong, right? How is Shem supposed to know that this was wrong, right? I mean, and very, very early, there is definitely this sense that, there are things that Israel is not allowed to do that the nations are allowed to do, right? I mean, now I don't know enough. I don't know enough about world religion to say that Judaism is absolutely unique in this regard, right? But most religions, when they say such and such a thing is not allowed, they mean for everybody, right? I mean, Mormons don't say, oh, alcohol and caffeine are fine for non-Mormons, right? Everybody's supposed to not drink, right? I mean, it's one of the reasons for such societal conflict in American society, right? I mean, the Catholic Church doesn't teach Catholics shouldn't get abortions. Catholics shouldn't use birth control, right? Teach nobody should get abortions. Nobody should get birth control, right? Whereas we don't, I mean, and there are things that we say that nobody should do, right? But, when is the last time you saw the Jewish Community Relations Council send a busload of people to Annapolis to ban the sale of pork, right? A busload of people to Annapolis to demand that all commerce cease for 25 hours from dusk on Friday to dark on Saturday, right? These are things that are commandments directed to Jews. And it's absolutely fine. I mean, it's totally legitimate. I mean, sometimes I know I'm getting on a bit of a riff here, but I hear people complain to me about, oh, how can that possibly be kosher when it's sitting right next door to the non-kosher product, right? Do you realize that the majority of meat that a kosher slaughterhouse sells is not kosher?
Right.
Right? I mean, you've got the entire back half of the cow, which is sold as non-kosher, plus any cow that's slaughtered and inspected and found not to be kosher. What, you think they throw it away?
Of course not.
They sell it as non-kosher, right? If we held that nobody was allowed to eat non-kosher meat, right? The kosher slaughterhouses couldn't sell that as non-kosher, right? Couldn't sell that as non-kosher. And instead of being 4 times as expensive as treif meat, kosher meat would be 10 times as expensive as treif meat, right? Which might not, I don't know. But anyway, but so Rashi is telling us here that yes, Shem knew that this was wrong because this was a universal moral standard, right? That after the flood, the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach, the 7 Noahide commandments, which were voluntarily accepted by the nations, okay, included a ban on sexual immorality, right? Included a ban on sexual immorality. So Shem knew that what he was doing was wrong, all right? And thus they were entirely justified in their anger, even if it wasn't rape, right? Even if it wasn't rape, even if it was, let's say, seduction, right? The seduction is still wrong, right? It's still wrong because it's wrong as premarital sex. I mean, even if it was consensual, right? Even if it was consensual, and that's why he has to say now, but I want to marry her, right? Which undermines the point that you made a while ago, Barnaby. Although I agree with you, that the verb yikach can certainly be read as marriage, right? But again, that is just another example of the ambiguity and lack of clarity in this whole text, right? Because at least part of the objection, at least formally, seems to be that even if this was consensual, they should have gotten married first, right? And Shem's response is not, well, I did marry her, right? It's, I would like to marry her. I want to marry her, right? So Hamor spoke with them, saying, my son Shem, his soul has a liking for your daughter. Please give her to him for a wife. All right. He desires. Okay. Rashi's just explaining one verb by another verb. Okay. And so impose upon me a large marriage settlements and gifts, and I will give you as much as you ask of me, but give me the girl for a wife. Okay. So in verse 12, right? So the word is mohar. Okay. Mohar, which it's not exactly clear what that means. All right. It's we generally translate it as bride price, right? It's the same exact word in Arabic, by the way. Okay. And the same exact word. It's not even a cognate. It's the exact word, mohar. But what is this bride price? Okay, we don't have this concept, right? You don't buy your wife from her father. You don't buy your wife from her family, right? So what is this mohar? What is this bride price? It means a ketubah. Okay, now means a ketubah. Now, what does that mean? Okay, because I mean, if I ask you what does the word ketubah mean, right? Everybody knows that. It's the fancy marriage contract, right? That you have framed hanging on your wall, right? But that's not what it means in this context, right? If you look at certain Talmudic discussions, it'll say if a man does such and such a thing, he has to divorce his wife and pay the ketubah, right? If a woman does such and such a thing, like we saw this past Shabbat when I brought certain Talmudic quotes about Eretz Yisrael, right? And one of the I didn't bring the whole quote, right? But if you're living in Chutz La'aretz, if you're living outside of Israel, and the husband wants to make aliyah, he can compel his wife to come with him. And if she will not agree to come with him, he can divorce her and not pay the ketubah. Okay, so that's what it means here. But what does it mean to pay the ketubah or to not pay the ketubah? Right? Does anybody know? All right. So in the ketubah, the man promises that if he should divorce his wife, he must pay her X sum of money. Okay, now most non-Orthodox Jews do not know this because for us, the ketubah is a ritual object, basically, right? I mean, and we don't know the actual contents of the ketubah because it's not enforceable, right? It's not enforceable. I mean, first of all, nobody enters a marriage anticipating that they're going to get divorced, right? And so that's one of the things that you have. If you're a rabbi, you have to be careful, because I have literally heard a rabbi read an English translation of the ketubah, and where it comes to in the event of divorce, blah blah blah, and the people in the audience actually booed. Okay, I'm not joking, because who wants to talk about what happens if you get divorced at your wedding, right? But it is a business transaction. It is a business transaction, and if you have a merger, right, and the merger fails, there should be somewhere in the contract what happens if the partners want to split up, right?
And
So
isn't that called a prenuptial agreement these days?
well, look, there are certainly like civil legal prenups, right? And there's also a halachic prenup. Okay, the halachic prenup, we tend not to do that so much because we have the Lieberman clause in the ketubah. Okay, right. Thank you, Gail. Right. I mean, the whole issue is of those kind of prenups is right, because we do not recognize civil divorce as sufficient to end a marriage, right? And so if the couple get divorced, the woman cannot remarry unless the husband has given her a get, a Jewish divorce, and that can only be given by the husband, right? And so the Lieberman clause, which at least in New York is legally civilly enforceable, but it doesn't really have a lot of teeth, right? Because the Lieberman clause really says in the event of civil divorce, they will go to the Beit Din of the conservative movement and do what they're told, right? So, and then what happens if they don't, right? So, you know, the Orthodox world does not recognize the Lieberman clause. Why? Because Lieberman taught at JTS. If he had accepted the offer from Yeshiva University instead of JTS, the Lieberman clause would be perfectly valid in the Orthodox world. But because he taught at JTS, the Lieberman clause is not valid. Okay, so a halachic prenup essentially, and in a certain sense, the halachic prenup could actually have more teeth depending on how it's written, right? In other words, that some of them say, you know, if they're civilly divorced and the husband won't give a get, he has to pay $1,000 a day, for as long as he's refraining from giving a get. Or there are others that are halachically more problematic that basically say, if they have a civil divorce and the husband won't give a get, then the marriage is retroactively invalidated, right? I mean, it's problematic, but it's not actually as problematic as you might think. But this isn't a shiur on Hilchot Nisuin or Hilchot Gittin, so we don't have to get into that. But so that's what Shechem is saying, right? Impose upon me a law, a big ketubah, and I will agree to it, right? I mean, it's nevertheless curious, right? Because they're going to the halacha of marriage here. Well, now that I think about it, it's not as curious. They're going to the halacha of marriage here, but halachically, a marriage between a Jew and a Gentile is invalid anyway. So what is the whole thing of the ketubah, right? But then, and that's why I corrected myself almost mid-sentence, because they're saying you have to get circumcised, right? Which is the first step towards conversion, right? So if they're converting, then it's not, then it's actually could be a valid marriage. Okay, so Jacob's sons, specifically Shimon and Levi, answered Shechem and his father Hamor with cunning, and they spoke b'mirma, cunning or deception, and they spoke to the one who had defiled their sister Dinah. Okay. And then Rashi says, Scripture states that this was not trickery because, after all, he had defiled their sister Dinah. Okay, which I have to admit I don't understand, right? It's not trickery. It's not trickery because he had defiled it, which seems to me a case of like they had it coming to them, right? And fine, if you want to say they had it coming to them, then they had it coming to them. It's still trickery, right? It's still trickery, just like, if the police lure a criminal suspect someplace so they can arrest them, right? That's fine. It's still trickery, right? It's still trickery. It's just not maybe, morally culpable, right? So, and maybe that's what Rashi really means, right? And of course we're using English words, right? But Rashi is basically saying that they are not culpable for what they did because he had it coming to them. Okay. And they said to them, we cannot do this thing to give our sister to a man who has a foreskin, for that is a disgrace to us. Ki cherpa hi lanu. Okay, so Rashi's going to explain the word cherpa, right? A disgrace. It's a defect, okay, a defect. But the Rashi, the Hebrew is a little bit more, is worth plunging in. Shemetz pasul hu etzleinu. Okay, a shemetz is like, what's the word I'm looking for? A defect. Okay, a defect. But the word pasul right? I mean, you may be familiar with that word, right? Pasul, like a pasul Torah scroll, right? Or a pasul mezuzah, right? Pasul means invalid. Okay, so it's a defect and it's invalid. In other words, and what they're saying, what they're recognizing here is that we understand that you might think that this is fine, but for us it's a problem, right? And in that sense, I mean, Rashi, well, I don't know. I mean, we know, for example, right, that when the Jews started encountering the Hellenistic world, right, and the Hellenistic world was more natural is good, right? Natural is good, unnatural is bad, right? And therefore, you know, the Hellenistic world, the Greco-Roman world, considered circumcision to be a horrible thing, right? Because you're defacing, right? Nature created us perfect, right? Or at least the men. Well, the women don't, all the more so, right? But right, the human body is perfect, right? Why do you want to go and deface it, right? And so there was even surgery that some Jewish men went through, very painful surgery to reverse the circumcision, right? And so, you know, but then again, I mean, so Rashi lived in a Christian world, right? And also, I mean, I would venture to guess that 1,000 years ago in France, very few Christian men were circumcised, right? So, you know, so Rashi is explaining, right, that it is a defect. If we wish to insult another person, he says, you are uncircumcised, arel ata o ben arel. You're the son of an uncircumcised person. And then the word herpa, bechoma kom gaduf. Wherever the word herpa appears, this is an insult. Okay. And there's an interesting development. I mean, this is interesting in the development of specifically conservative Jewish liturgy, okay? Because in the Shabbat Amidah, right, Yismach Moshe b'matnat halko, right, Moses rejoiced in the gift of his portion, right? And then it's talking about the gift of Shabbat, and the Siddur originally said, "V'gam bimnuchato lo yishkanu arelim," right? The uncircumcised shall not enjoy Shabbat rest, right? It's given to Israel. It's not given to the arelim, okay, to the uncircumcised. And how many of you grew up with the Silverman Siddur or are familiar with the Silverman Siddur? Right? That was if you grew up conservative, you grew up with Silverman, right? Because all of you except Barnaby are older than I am, right? And Sim Shalom didn't come in until 1985. Okay. So before that, it was the Silverman. And the Silverman changed, instead of saying V'gam bimnuchato lo yishkanu arelim, it says V'gam bimnuchato lo yishkanu rishayim. Instead of the uncircumcised, it says the wicked. Okay. Now, why exactly Silverman made that emendation, I'm not exactly sure. Although it may simply have shied away from, you know, something that was sort of explicitly physical, especially dealing with the sexual organ. But I know that Sim Shalom put back the word Arelim, but I want to see how it translates it. Okay. Nor do those outside the covenant know its rest. Okay, so it says Arelim, but the English in the 85 Sim Shalom is those outside the covenant, which actually I like. It's very clever. I mean, it's not a literal translation, but do you see where it's clever, right? Because right, so an arel, what is the opposite of an arel? Somebody who's had a brit milah, right? And brit milah means the covenant of the circumcision, right? So if you are an arel, you're outside the covenant. So it's actually that translation makes me very happy. It's because it's really it's very, very clever, and it sort of conveys the meaning of the term without having to translate it quite as literally. But we will consent to you if you will be like us, that every male will be circumcised. It's 9 o'clock, so I want to wrap up, right? But if you guys get circumcised, then we can marry you, and not only she can marry you, but we'll take your daughters, you'll take our daughters, we'll be one big happy family, right? And the residents of Shechem say, oh yeah, this is great, right? These men are peaceful with us. Verse 21, they will dwell in the land and do business there. Land, behold, it is spacious enough for them. We will take their daughters for our wives, for ourselves as wives, and we will give them our daughters. Okay, so it's a great business transaction rather. And then of course what happens is that so they all get circumcised, right? And then while they're recovering, Shimon and Levi go through the town and kill all of the males who are recovering from circumcision, which displeases Jacob, right? So we all know this. So again, but if you look at the Rashi does not condemn them as much as Jacob does, right? And which I think is a part of his whole agenda, where it's much more hagiographic. I mean, I think where the Torah itself is ambivalent or even condemnatory about certain figures, the rabbinic tradition, I think, wants to redeem them. All right. Any questions, comments?
Well, I know I mentioned earlier that I was going to mention a certain book, and I'm going to just shout out right now. Has anyone heard of or have read The Red Tent by Anita Diamond?
Yeah.
Yes. So in short, it's about, it's a story told from Dina's perspective, and, it turns her, into the subject rather than the object. And in this book, her relationship with Shechem is depicted as consensual, and the brothers simply just didn't like it.
Yeah.
Let's give it a read.
Yeah. All right. Good night, everybody. Thanks for joining.
Night.
Good night.
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 Thank you.
Thank you.